Carlos Tao. We, just before we pressed record, spent a minute or two breathing and being present in a really simple, beautiful practice that you led us through. And there's something about that for me that kind of represents my impression of you, which is, as somebody who has watched you from afar for a few years, I feel as though you are deeply embodied and very much inhabit the realms of sort of like the mystery and magic of the felt sense. And there's something really beautiful about that. And there's also something about that that makes you a really difficult person to put in a box when it comes to introducing you at the beginning of an interview, which I actually really love because I kind of think it's the key to your magic. But it also means that I have been wrestling with how am I going to describe you to people so they have a framework for understanding you in the context of this discussion. And my sense of it is that as this breathing practice that we just did felt, is that your desire is to lead us into this, vast and mystical and magical experience of our own body. But the body in a real way is actually just a portal through which we can access a vast and mystical and magical experience of the universe. And there are lots of sort of methods or modalities or whatever that you could hang that exploration on, but that is my sense of you. And so my first question is that true? And my second question would be sort of, where does that come from inside of you?
You just touched on one of the biggest difficulties that I have is in describing what we do, and to do it succinctly and in a way that it's just a couple of sentences, which always seems to be what marketing people want me to do. And how do I write this here? And I'm like, well, can we just have like a 2-hour conversation and then you'll understand? But so I would say yes. I think you touched on a lot of beautiful things in the description that you gave, and there's so much. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. But I think that's fair. That's fair of what we're trying to do is, I'd say in a sense, we're trying to re-enchant the world. We're trying to bring us back into communion with an understanding of what we are and what this universe is that is closer to appropriate than what we've had before, because we've played within these two, let's say these two poles of the beginning. Everything was magic, everything was mysterious, everything was strange and weird and other and beyond the ability of our minds to comprehend. And that took us a certain distance of understanding, or let's say it took us a little closer to something like right seeing or wisdom. And somewhere along the line, and depending on who you ask or what books you've read, somewhere in our history, especially in the West, there was this schism, there was this break where we kind of confused what the old stories were for and where the truth in these old stories and these myths lay. And they lay something, there was a deep truth to them, but since the truth wasn't true in detail, there was division, where we began to explore the capacities of our rational minds to understand the gross material world. And we made the arrogant conclusion that this was the only way to see the world, and this was the only world that existed. And there was a break there, and slowly there was, I was going to say it was a subtle war, but it wasn't that subtle in a lot of senses. So whether you take the break back between Plato and Aristotle and that schism of a way of seeing the world, or somewhere in the 12th centuries, in the scientific revolutions of the 12th centuries, or later on, when Rene Descartes said, I think that the mind is something separate from the material, and there was this kind of like break, we were fractured, and we kind of moved off in that direction where our view of the world has become this very scientific, reductionist, and it's as incorrect as the vision that it was trying to replace. It's as limited as that vision. And there's something in us that needs to combine objective reality with subjective experience. To be told that we're a freak of nature, a little cosmic accident in an unimportant blue ball, in an unremarkable solar system, at the edge of an average galaxy, at the corner of infinite universe, doesn't, while that may be true in detail, the story behind that we're just that does not fit with the subjective experience when we go inside of what it is to be conscious and to be human. There's something else underneath there that we've lost. The appropriate state when we're really seeing correctly, I mentioned this earlier before you press record, is a state of reverence. And that reverence doesn't need to, in a sense, that reverence isn't, I'm going to practice seeing everything with reverence, or I'm going to practice seeing everything in a way that's sacred. That comes naturally. That's the natural byproduct of seeing something different. So how to move from this old way of seeing, how to shift that way of seeing into a clear version of what we actually are, a felt sense of what we actually are, what this actually is. We've kind of glorified order and forgot that order is drawn from chaos. So we've glorified the known and we've forgotten the mystery. So how do we bridge those? How to, again, bring them together? It's not to get rid of order. It's not to get rid of the literal, but it's to bridge it with this other half of ourselves, another half of existence. And the difficulty is that, imagine that you were wearing rose-colored glasses. It's a very old metaphor, but you're wearing, rose-colored glasses, and someone can tell you forever that there's colors that exist, that there's greens and blues and purples, and you could understand it intellectually and look around and kind of think that this different shade of red is purple, and you're told that this stuff exists out there and trees are green. But that's something in the intellectual vertical. And you can think of our ways of moving forward. There's the horizontal. So we move our lives this way. It's like, okay, I see red, but now, I was told those other colors, and I see other shades of red, because within my current capacity to see, this is all I can do. So how do we move from the horizontal into something like being able to take off those glasses, to see the world without the glasses, when what the glasses are, it's our culture, it's our learning, it's our pathologies, it's what we've been told, it's what we've believed, it's been the interpretations of ancient traditions. All of these things are the rose-colored glasses between us and the world that filters out most of what's out there. I mean, even our bodies filter out most of our sensory information. We're aware of a tiny sliver, and it makes sense because we can be overwhelmed and overloaded. But something needs to happen to take us out of the horizontal and shift us into the vertical. And this is where ancient shamanic techniques of ecstasy and transformation come in, where yogic practices, where an ecology of practices comes in that does something that shifts us and glitches. Psychedelic experience is the same thing, where there's this moment where what we thought was true is shaken and stirred, where the order that we thought was there, we see that it's an order that was imposed on something else that's much deeper and much more mystical underneath. So helping us move from this horizontal plane through transformational experiences into the possibility of a vision that not only soothes the mind, but soothes the soul, where we're bridging these two parts of ourselves, um, is what we're doing. It's more complex than that because we tend to be very prone. The things that make us beautiful and adaptable are also the things that make us tend toward being vulnerable to self-deception. So it's I think what happens a lot with the new age, where it's like everything is beautiful, everything is the same. My interpretation of what's happening is just as valid as yours. And there's something within reality that there's an overlap that needs to happen where we can be self-deceived. So that's where things like community, things like practices that balance out the other practices. Psychedelics is a great example of this, where something called inflation can happen, where someone has a psychedelic experience and their world is shook and they have this beautiful mystic vision, and they come out confused and they're like, well, I'm God. It's like, okay, hold your horses, yes, but what you're seeing, that's a part of the truth. Like there's something else that's going on where this vision that you've had needs to be broadened, it needs to be refined, it needs to be um, put through these other practices, it needs to be put up maybe not towards the interpretations of ancient traditions, but looking at the patterns that ancient traditions were trying to unfold. Um, Ancient traditions, myths, these fables that we have, we've made the mistake of calling them untrue because we were looking for truth in detail. But there's a deeper truth where they're true in pattern. They're trying to unveil something deep about what it means to be human, what it means to exist, what it means to see, what it means to be seen, what it means to move forward in life, how we place ourselves within all of this, how we place ourselves in some kind of hierarchy with the mystery and with the order that makes sense, how we place ourselves within each other. Because if I'm God and you're God, and what does that mean? Where can we meet? If there's personality between us, and I can never have the objective experience of what it's like to be you, then how do we communicate? How do we move forward in dialogos or in dialogue together? I mean, all of these things are within these ancient traditions. So there's an arrogance of thinking that um, these questions that have been being um, digested and chewed and wrestled with, wrestle is a good word, wrestled with for 10,000 years, that somehow you're going to have one psychedelic experience, have some insight, and then the answers are there. In classes, when I started to bring these questions up in these experiences, there's always some, like I'm asking a question that someone's been asking for, 15, 20,000 years, and we're still wrestling with it. The best minds, the best spiritual minds that have ever been have been wrestling with, and someone wants to answer it in the first, half second, and they want to be the first one to answer. We also glorify that, right? We glorify being right. We've forgotten that being wrong is a prerequisite to being right. And if you're wrong enough, eventually you'll get closer to right. But if you like, that glorification of get the answer right and get it fastest and get it on your first try is not the thing. It's more like be willing to be wrong, be willing to put yourself to the fire and wrestle with what's there. So moving within these worlds. And I love the work that you're doing. I saw a little bit of it. I hadn't seen it before. You reached out to do this interview, but I saw it, and it's really thoughtful. And there's something about the way that you work which resonated deeply with me, which was a relationship with the mystery that doesn't ask you to sacrifice your rationality. That we can bring these two together. That we can figure out what is trying to be said without saying that everything is true, but there's some truth there that we can move through these practices and these ideas and begin to flesh out the depth of meaning that lies underneath them. So that's a very long answer to your very succinct question, but I'm hoping that gives everyone a bit of an idea of what we're doing.
I think it absolutely will. And it's opened up a lot of questions for me. And so I'm just going to pick one and roll with it. Something that you mentioned as we've been talking, and also that you mentioned before we hit record, is this, play between structure and freedom, order and chaos. And it's something that is ever present for me, this kind of tug of war between the two. And it's interesting for me because over the last few years, I've come from quite a traditional background of yoga practice. And there's been something that has been quite lovely for me in that, because it's allowed me to scratch beneath the surface of what you typically get in, yoga land these days, and see what all of that points to. But there's also been something in that is, for me personally, has been a little bit constraining, because you get all these like rules of practice, or, this is the way that it's done, or whatever. And then I have come up occasionally against these points of friction where, the system has worked for me so far, and what it's created inside of me is an intuition to move or explore this way. And then I have to sort of deal with myself as I navigate my relationship between the rules and my lived experience. And so I think about this in terms of like, if I imagine the sages back in the day, in the forest experimenting, just to, simplify things a lot. And I can imagine a situation where through their embodied exploration, they uncovered some kind of insight about the nature of reality and attempted to communicate the process through which they arrived at that insight. And I can imagine a series of, iteration where over time, their attempt to communicate what their experience was becomes more fixed as systems of practice or rules or whatever. And initially that was probably just an attempt to communicate what their experience was. And then many thousands of years later, here we are with these very, detailed, systematic, first this, then this, look here, breathe there, whatever, which I think probably really work well for some people or work up to a point, but I also think can sometimes, structure can be cages over time, and we lean into them sometimes too much, maybe these days, because we don't trust our own experience. And so I think the structure is helpful as we learn to understand the language of the body. And then there's that moment of friction where we learn, like, now that I know my ABCs, how do I write a poem? Or, and so, yeah, I don't even know what the question is in that, but I suspect that you have something to say about that.
Yes. Very good. Very good. This is something that I've thought about, and I've envisioned, and I use that same image of let's say going out into the forest, and comes back and is just different, and the people from his village are like, what happened to you? Like, you look different, your eyes are different, you're speaking differently, like what was it that you did? And he's like, well, I went out there, and I spent some time, and I was breathing and being with myself, and I was moving and feeling, and I'm like, well, wait, how exactly did you move? What exactly were the movements? So your foot was turned out at how many degrees? Okay, got it. And you could just kind of see, like, no, wait, it's not where the foot is, it's the process that happened underneath within the wrestling with these things, and pretty quickly it just kind of like, here's the formula. But there's another thing beneath that, and you said it. I'm not sure exactly how you said it, but I remember nodding right now when you were speaking, that you said that they were writing down the practices that got them to the insight or the experience. I have a bigger issue, or a bigger concern with what's been brought out through time. Isn't just, hey, this is what I did, here's the practices that I did. It's, here's the interpretation of what I discovered, and then this is what you should discover within these words. So when you do this, it means this, and that's where it gets very strange, when we're trying to again, with order, we're trying to map out, we're trying to take the chaos out of all of this. So, we've mapped out, I don't know how many levels of samadhi. I think the Buddha mapped out, I don't even know how many mind, like a million mind moments in a second, or whatever crazy number that was. We've mapped out all the koshas and doshas and the subtle bodies and how many chakras they are. And then you could just see over time, it's like, well, now we've got the shapes of the chakra. Now we've got the colors. Now we've got the sounds. Now we got the bija. Now we've got, and it's all of this stuff where, again, it's without even realizing, we're trying to put ourselves within relationship with the mystery. And as soon as we start getting closer to the mystery, we're trying to rip the mystery down and turn the mystery into order. We're trying to take the mystery and move it out into this other place, but then we're still there in that place where we started. So to me, it's even more the interpretations, the interpretations and translations of what these sages meant and what they did. And here's the scholarly thing. And while the different forms of yoga, we'll bring it back to yoga for a second, different forms of yoga, there's being a bhakti where you're just all in devotion, or jnana, you're a yogi of the mind and of scholarship. And the way that I've read it mostly has been like, well, we're all one of these, this is a bhakti yogi, Hare Krishnas, they're bhakti yogis. And, these scholars, they're jnana yogis. But I mentioned something about self-deception earlier. If you're a bhakti yogi, you're extremely vulnerable to self-deception. You're extremely vulnerable of being confused by your guru. And maybe it's not even the guru that's doing anything, the teacher that's doing anything, but your devotion to just this one state of being, this one ecology, this one type of practice makes you extremely vulnerable to self-deception. The same thing if you're a jnana yogi and you're scholarly and you're like, my brain is everything. My brain is God. I can understand this stuff and I know it. And I've studied it and I've read 1,500 books on the subject, so I know it. You're extremely vulnerable to self-deception. So within an ecology of practices, to have these practices that kind of counterbalance our tendencies towards one or the other, to have a way of looking at these things. Because especially with these interpretations throughout time, that's someone's opinion, that's one person's interpretation, that's one person's not only interpretation, but one person's choice of languages, one person's choice of metaphors. It doesn't mean that that's the end of this. And that's where it gets tricky, where we're sold not only that the journey is the sacred, but it's also, here's where you will reach. Here's how it's going to look. Here's what you should do. This is what and then it's like, well, it's a foregone conclusion already. Then there is no relationship there. And within the practices that have been going forward through time, that there's also that sense of too much formula sometimes. And then there's the other thing where there's someone coming in that's never done anything. It's like, well, just, if you've ever, you teach yoga, or you just practice yoga? Do you teach? You teach also. Walk into a room of yogis, walk in there, do your centering, and then tell everybody to just begin to move freely and see what happens. Everybody will freeze. There's such a thing as too much freedom becoming a tyranny. Something in the middle needs to happen, where we're putting ourselves within these different tensions. And what used to be done in some places was that there was a community. So we'd kind of come together, kind of like you and I are doing now, and there would be this reverence that what's going to happen in ancient Greece, it was the logos. So we would come together in dialogos. We would come together and we would make a commitment that we're not, it doesn't matter which one of us is right or wrong. That's not what we're committed to. We're committed to both of us being closer to wisdom when we finish, to like putting ourselves to the wrestling fire. So whatever's not true in me, in my understanding, in my vision, gets to be burned away by the depth of our conversation together. And that this logos, this mysterious thing that's inside me that I don't have control over, the same thing that knows how to grow my cells and my bones and somehow convinces all of my cells that they're not individual little life forms anymore. But apart from that, they're also part of this cohesive whole, this mysterious other thing that starts to bubble up, and we both start to kind of be in shock over what we're saying and what we're realizing, and we're kind of swept up in this together. Um, these are the things that have been lost, and we're bringing in just little bits and pieces. And it's not without good reason, because some of the interpretations that have come down through time are just either outdated, they don't make sense to us anymore because the world in which they were written is no longer the world that is in front of us now. Or for you and I, this is not the culture that we grew up with. And as much as we study for the rest of our lives, we'll never know what it's like to be someone that's birthed from within that culture, that our rose-colored glasses are colored from within the culture that wrote these interpretations. So there's a lot of you said friction. There's a lot of friction between what's the depth of the truth and pattern in those moments, and how much do I have to sift through in order to get there. So we bring in little pieces of this, of the exotic, and then we're throwing this hodgepodge together and making our own interpretations without a deeper understanding of where this came from, of what are the ideas that are really being wrestled with, of what might this really mean. And that's another part of what we're doing. And you could tell that these are the things that I've been wrestling with for a long time, of how to bring in the ancient wisdom in a way that honors it, but bring it in not as a way that we swallow all of it, that we can reverse engineer and go back through it and remember what it's like to think, and what it's like to dialogue, and what it's like to wrestle with deep ideas, and what it's like to feel, and what it's like to contemplate, and what it's like to meditate. These are not the same things. It's not just one practice or one thing. This is philosophy is a way of life, in the way that the ancients used to use it. It's not like, you do your 9 to 5 stuff, and then for an hour out of the day, you kind of like go to confession or your penance, and you do your practice, and then right the way that we were seeing the world before. And that's, I'm not going to say it's evil, it's just the reality of it, is that it tends to absorb things within a way that makes sense for the culture, moving in the same way that it's been moving before. So yoga is revolution, rebellious. It's asking people to see the world and feel the world in a very different way than culture is expressing. So it comes to the West in a very short amount of time. It's absorbed, become part of the culture. So instead of it being something that transforms culture and transforms people's way of seeing the world, it becomes a way to be more accepting of culture, to be more accepting of the day-to-day, and make you maybe a little bit nicer person, and you feel better a little bit from having your practice. And there's something good to be said about that. But it's not that transformative, rebellious, frame-breaking, reality-shifting thing that all of a sudden moves us from the horizontal into this vertical, where now we're looking at the world, not from here, but now our perspective is from up here. So the breadth and depth of what we can see is different and big. And once we get here, we see things differently. So we move through the world differently from within the scene. And with moving through the world differently, that means the world around us changes because of what we've seen and how we are in it. And that affords us the ability to, again, be transformed by the world and go up a little bit higher, which affords us the ability to change the world. And that changed world reciprocally changes us again. And now we're in this, I don't know if you can see, but that's goosebumps right there. Which means that something that's coming out of my mouth is something that's resonating deeply with something inside me. So it's this reciprocal opening, this reciprocal relationship with us and the world. And it can work the other way too, where the world kind of sucks. So we close up a little bit, we disconnect from these places inside of ourselves. And as we do that, the world shrinks. And as the world shrinks, it feels a little bit worse and a little bit darker. So we shrink in response, and the world shrinks. So we can have reciprocal opening, which is what we're trying to move into, or reciprocal closings. And I think a lot of the depression that we're seeing now, even though outwardly we're we're as good as we've ever been, if not much better. But the amount of time that we have, the amount of lifespan that we have, the resources at our disposal, our abilities to have many, many, many friends, to know many, many, many people. All of these things have grown exponentially, but something inside of us is moving in the other direction. So even within this apparent world that's doing this, there's still this reciprocal closing that's happening. And again, we're trying to shift out of that. And I'd be lying if I said I remembered what question started this, but I hope that was that was that was a good place to pause and let you kind of reflect and ask me something else.
So it's actually made me think of something that I think I might have heard you say in a podcast or something like that. And it was something along the lines of, you know, I'm known for this kind of like weird type of movement, but I actually came into all of this from the perspective of philosophy. And so something that feels really clear to me when I listen to you speak is that, you know, the body and, you know, the quest for meaning through the body and the quest for meaning in existence are kind of deeply integrated for you. And so I'm wondering what that looks like in, like, or why is the body for you the centerpiece for this deeply you know, philosophical exploration of what it means to exist?